August of 1996. The sound of a traction cable snapping under extreme pressure echoes across the deck of the salvage vessel. Screams cut through the icy wind of the North Atlantic as the engineering crew watches, in absolute stunned silence, the ocean swallow back its greatest prize. 84 years after the original tragedy, history was repeating itself mercilessly before the cameras. The most colossal piece of the ship ever brought to light plummeted in free fall into the dark abyss. They weren't just losing 15 tons of steel and history. They were watching the giant sink for the second time. And the true invisible force that snapped that safety threshold would remain buried in the deep. Bringing that steel giant back to the surface, even just a fragment of it, seemed like absolute heresy to a large part of society, which saw the site as an untouchable graveyard. And, at the same time, it was hailed as the greatest feat of modern salvage engineering by others. In 1996, the exploration team wasn't there to do gentle or delicate work. They weren't there to collect small decorated porcelain plates, ivory hairbrushes, or jewels lost in the dark ocean mud. The target of this operation was brutal, wildly ambitious, and above all, daunting. The mission was to raise an authentic piece of the ship's own hull, tearing through the funereal silence of more than 8 decades. We're talking about 15 solid tons of dark steel, held together by thousands of rivets severely corroded by time, crushing water pressure, and the relentless bite of salt. The sheer audacity of this plan immediately drew the anxious eyes of the entire world. And, as expected, the heavy financing of investors hungry for the glory of conquering a legend. There was an aura of triumph on that deck, an almost unshakable certainty that technology could, finally, tame the deep. If you're fascinated by these hidden chapters of our history, by the silent battles between human stubbornness and the uncontrollable forces of nature, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and follow us through every detail of this deep investigation. Preparing for the salvage required months of complex calculations and heated debates about how to defy a pressure that would effortlessly crush any conventional vessel or equipment. The mobilized fleet carried the true elite of oceanography, seasoned commanders and chief engineers who believed they had absolute control over every mathematical and meteorological variable. The massive operation involved specialized cranes, ultra-high tension cables developed specifically for this undertaking, and a naval logistics operation that rivaled military precision. Their goal was to raise an entire wall of first-class cabins, a colossal fragment that had broken away after a violent lateral scraping impact suffered years earlier. That exact structural damage had condemned the vessel to inevitable collapse, bow first. But there was a silent detail that meticulous spreadsheets and state-of-the-art sonar simply could not quantify: the merciless, unpredictable nature of the North Atlantic. The frozen ocean that swallowed the most imposing passenger ship of all time on that fateful April night in 1912 had never forgiven human arrogance in the past. And now, it was absolutely not willing to give back its most iconic piece without a truly devastating fight. The dark abyss was about to collect a new toll, proving that the extreme confidence of those specialists would soon collide with a brutal physical force well beyond any safety margin. The hull fragment chosen for this Herculean mission was not selected by mere chance. It was an absolutely colossal section of the vessel's starboard side, an immense wall of steel and rivets that had, at the height of its luxury and sophistication, housed the exclusive first-class cabins. This dramatic, imposing structure had broken away from the ship's main body shortly after the violent lateral scrape against the iceberg hidden in the dark waters. That was the silent, fatal blow that ruptured the watertight compartments and condemned the steel giant, with its majestic 4 funnels, to sink slowly, agonizingly, bow first, before violently splitting in 2. Now, 8 decades after that event, that same metal wall rested alone, severely battered, in the abyssal deep. Raising 15 tons of metal from a crushing depth of nearly 13,000 feet demanded far more than brute force alone. It demanded extreme physics, calculated and reviewed down to the finest detail. The technical team and chief engineer knew perfectly well that using conventional cranes operated from the surface would be a guaranteed catastrophic disaster. The math was irrefutable and cruel. Traditional steel cables descending thousands of feet through dense salt water would accumulate so much weight from their own mass that they would snap under their own tension, long before ever touching the piece they were meant to rescue. The ocean, with its merciless pressure of hundreds of atmospheres, allows no shortcuts. That's when the expedition's leadership devised a maneuver that was, at once, incredibly tactical and uniquely brilliant. If the ocean wouldn't allow them to pull the steel from above, they would make the steel float from below. The salvage plan involved sending high-precision submersibles to the ocean floor, operating in total darkness, to attach enormous lift bags directly to the heavy ironwork of the massive piece. But there was a fascinating technical challenge in this equation that few outside naval engineering could have predicted. If the team tried to fill those immense rescue balloons with air pumped from the surface, the crushing pressure of the ocean floor would compress the gas until it became useless. Or, in an even worse scenario, it would cause an explosive, uncontrollable expansion as the piece began rising and the external pressure decreased. The solution devised to work around physics was bold. They filled the heavy lift bags not with air, but with diesel fuel. Since diesel is physically lighter than seawater, it would generate the exact buoyancy needed to raise the structure, with the crucial advantage of being a liquid, making it immune to the extreme contractions or expansions caused by pressure changes during the ascent. Everything seemed perfectly orchestrated. The engineering of the impossible was rigged on the floor of the North Atlantic, ready to challenge the rigid laws of submarine gravity. Cameras monitored every millimeter of the process, sending ghostly images to the screens in the command room, where the ocean's nighttime surface reflected against the windows. But there was a detail that financial spreadsheets and density calculations could not control. And it was at that exact moment of apparent human mastery that the silent gears of fate began turning, irreversibly, toward an outcome no one aboard was prepared to face. The operation reached its most intense and exhausting psychological climax when the immense structure of aged steel finally broke through the heavy barrier of abyssal darkness. That authentic fragment of history rose slowly through the dense water, like a metallic ghost awakening from a painfully long sleep. For the first time in 84 long years, the real, grand, tangible silhouette of the defeated giant entered the range of the powerful underwater floodlights mounted on the exploration fleet. The artificial glare struck the metal, consumed by dark rust and marine formations. The main sonar display, which dictated the heartbeat rhythm of every engineer in the control room, confirmed the most anticipated figure of that entire overnight journey. Just 200 feet of water separated the historic trophy from the churning ocean surface. The tension aboard gave way to a brief wave of relief that bordered on the indescribable. The bold maneuver architected by the technical team was working with surgical precision. They watched, awestruck through the monitors, as the immense structure held stable in the middle of the ocean, perfectly supported by the buoyant force of the massive diesel-filled bags. To crown what seemed like the definitive, undeniable victory of that million-dollar undertaking, The expedition's leadership authorized an act loaded with overwhelming symbolism. Professional deep-water divers jumped into the dark, freezing waters, swimming directly toward the 15-ton block. As they approached, they reached out their hands and were able finally to touch the cold original steel, feeling the rough texture of the heavy rivets forged in British shipyards at the dawn of the 20th century. The atmosphere inside the command cabin of the main vessel instantly transformed into a celebration of euphoria and absolute relief. Faces marked by days of sleepless vigilance displayed smiles of fulfilled duty and technical pride. Looking out through the wide bridge windows, the infinite darkness of the open sea seemed, for one fleeting moment, to have been completely tamed by the persistence and brilliance of human engineering. The mighty North Atlantic, the same somber graveyard that had swallowed the majestic passenger liner, seemed to have accepted the return of a small, yet profoundly significant, piece of its greatest victim. The team tasted the intoxicating flavor of historic rescue. But there was a treacherous, invisible detail in that false sense of absolute control. And it was at that exact moment of premature celebration that the balance of power swung brutally back toward wild nature. In the hostile maritime environment, human arrogance and excessive confidence have a terrible habit of extracting a steep price, often immediately. The critical mistake of the expert team was celebrating the conquest while the steel was still submerged, floating dangerously close to the surge zone, and not anchored rigidly and definitively to the dry and safe deck of the vessel. And that changes everything we thought we knew about the stability of extreme operation. The vulnerability of leaving 15 tons of dead weight suspended just below the surface, attached to miles of tensioned cables, created the perfect physical trap. While congratulations echoed inside the warm control room, an invisible, silent, and devastating change was beginning to form in the atmosphere just above their heads. What appeared to be the final chapter of a perfect and brilliant rescue was, in reality, rapidly molding itself into the exact scenario of the most catastrophic collapse in modern naval engineering. The atmosphere of absolute triumph that dominated the warm, lit interior of the command cabin was about to be brutally suffocated. While the immense structure of aged steel swayed treacherously, almost hypnotically, near the restless surface, the weather decided to intervene and flip the game, abruptly and mercilessly. The advanced radar on the main vessel, which just minutes earlier had displayed a relatively stable and promising picture, began sounding intensely, registering a sharp and deeply alarming drop in atmospheric pressure. This was not a simple weather change or a passing storm. The outer bands, violent and destructive, of Hurricane Edward had reached the exact salvage zone in the vast North Atlantic. The icy wind, previously just a sharp and constant breeze, typical of that solitary latitude, transformed almost instantly into an invisible wall of air at screaming velocity. The sound outside changed dramatically. It was a deafening howl, tearing through the communication antennas, the exposed suspension cables, and the heavy metal structures on the upper deck of the expedition ship. Looking through the thick, fogged glass windows of the command bridge, the vessel's commander and chief engineer watched the vast stormy night get violently torn apart by the white, furious foam of giant wave crests. That brief visual reprieve, which during the long hours of silent ascent had transmitted a false sense of technical mastery and icy calm, now revealed the darkest, most relentless, and uncontrollable face of nature in a state of absolute chaos. The waves, which dictate the unforgiving rhythm and ultimate success of any large-scale maritime operation, were no longer peaceful and rhythmic swells. They began rising in the darkness like massive, menacing mountains of salt water, crashing with growing and devastating fury against the hulls of the entire expedition fleet. Visibility dropped rapidly, and the ocean around them seemed to boil under the impact of the storm forming with truly terrifying speed. The main salvage vessel, a genuine marvel of contemporary naval engineering, weighing thousands of tons and equipped with the most sophisticated stabilization systems, was suddenly reduced to a mere fragile buoy adrift in the tempest. The immense ship began rising and falling with increasing brutality, dragged relentlessly upward, and then thrown violently downward by the monstrous swells generated by the advancing hurricane. Inside the control room, analytical despair replaced euphoria. Chairs, nautical charts, calculation boards, and portable equipment were hurled from side to side with every violent lurch. The technical team had to grip fixed panels with both hands just to keep their eyes focused on the computer screens, now flashing red alerts of imminent danger. And the critical problem, the silent detail that would soon destroy every certainty of the oceanography and engineering team, was that this aggressive dance on the sea surface was, under no circumstances, a harmless event. Far from it. In mechanical theory, and in the calm waters of simulated laboratory tests, the calculations worked masterfully. But in the real world, under the fury of the North Atlantic, reality collected its toll. Every upward heave of the ship, forced by the overwhelming passage of a new colossal wave, functioned like a lever of terrifying proportions. All of that violent, raw, uncontrollable kinetic energy was transferred, directly and without any effective mechanical dampening whatsoever, into the thick synthetic suspension lines plunging straight into the dark abyss of that submerged graveyard. Just below them, a mere 200 feet down, the 15 tons of historic salt-corroded steel rested tethered to the enormous diesel-filled lift bags. The physical behavior of that massive starboard hull fragment was the exact epicenter of the unfolding catastrophe. The heavy inertia of that immense piece of metal, anchored by the gigantic resistance and friction of the dense surrounding water, flatly refused to keep pace with the chaotic, accelerated rhythm being dictated by the storm above. The freezing water acted as a colossal brake against any movement. When the exploration vessel was launched skyward by the crest of a monstrous wave, it attempted, against the laws of inertia, to rip the piece from the deep with sudden and brutal force. And that changes everything we know about resistance limits in extreme missions. Salvage cables of this nature, even the most advanced built by industry in the late 20th century, are meticulously designed to withstand static, progressive tension. They are manufactured to hold a constant weight, pulling smoothly and strictly linearly toward the ocean floor. They are absolutely not built to withstand violent whipping and dynamic jolts, occurring in fractions of a second. And it was in exactly this logistical nightmare scenario that the perfect mathematics began collapsing before the wide eyes of the entire crew. The spasmodic movement of the ship's hull on the surface transformed the massive traction lines into true whips under excruciating tension. As the vessel lurched abruptly upward, pushed by the churning sea, the cables stretched to their molecular limit, groaning and shrieking metallically, audible even over the deafening roar of the hurricane wind. And it was at that exact moment of pure despair that the destructive clash of forces reached its absolute limit. The tension registered on the onboard computers shot alarmingly far beyond the red safety line stipulated by the world's top specialists. As the ship was violently thrust upward by the raging storm, stretching the synthetic cables and moorings to their unbearable extreme, gravity, combined with the colossal weight of the submerged piece, exerted a lethal reverse pull. The starboard structure dragged everything back down, toward the dark bottom. It was a true war of applied physics, waged without truce, second by second, between the machines created by human intellect and the primordial, inexhaustible fury of the ocean. The mathematics that had guaranteed the temporary triumph were being crushed by the North Atlantic, drawing the irreversible scenario in which earthly materials would invariably begin to fail. The relentless war of forces raging violently between the surface and the deep then reached its critical, unsustainable limit. To fully grasp the exact dimension of the colossal disaster about to unfold on the storm-lashed deck, we must dive deep into the merciless, unforgiving physics of that precise moment. The enormous synthetic mooring cables, considered the undisputed technological pinnacle of the 90s, were engineered with a laboratory safety margin to withstand truly formidable tension. However, that structural tolerance was built entirely on the premise of a static dead weight, rising millimeter by millimeter, in a smooth and perfectly controlled manner. The problem is that the indomitable fury of the North Atlantic violently rewrote all the rules. The great salvage vessel now behaved like a maddened pendulum in the heart of the storm, and the colossal inertia of the 15 submerged tons of steel acted as an invisible anchor caught in the abyssal currents. When the exploration ship was brutally hurled to the crest of a monstrous wave by the immense edges of the hurricane, the cables were abruptly yanked upward with unrestrained violence. In response, the crushing density of the seawater held the heavy piece of historic hull down below, stubbornly refusing to release its precious prize. This continuous friction and the gigantic weight of the water generated a terrifying kinetic conflict. The highly advanced synthetic material began stretching far beyond its industry-engineered elastic memory. At a microscopic level, the cable's intricate, complex fibers began rupturing and unraveling in a silent, lethal process, invisible to the stunned eyes of the crew on the outer deck, but relentlessly recorded by the powerful onboard computers in the command room with blaring alarms and flashing visuals. And that changes everything the experienced oceanography and naval engineering team had planned and calculated across months of exhaustive simulations in safe, warm, and artificially controlled laboratories. The atmosphere inside the command bridge grew dense and suffocating, charged with a heavy silence that violently contrasted with the constant roar of the storm outside. The expedition leader and the ship's commander exchanged wide-eyed looks, gripped by a cold, entirely analytical despair. There was not, in any of their vast and detailed tactical procedure manuals, a single emergency protocol designed to save the operation at that critical and vulnerable stage. If they ordered a premature and deliberate cut of the thick traction lines, they would lose the invaluable 15-ton target instantly and definitively to the ocean floor. But on the other hand, if they attempted to hold the steel giant through that uncontrollable storm, they ran the serious and frightening risk of the cables snapping with such magnetic and elastic force that they could tear through the protective hull structure of the salvage ship itself, placing the lives of everyone aboard in immediate danger. It was a terrifying standoff, where every choice would result in catastrophic loss. But there was a mechanical, treacherous detail that dramatically accelerated the expedition's ruin. The physical behavior of the enormous diesel-filled bags, celebrated until that exact minute as the great stroke of genius in submarine engineering, began turning terribly against the team itself. With the constant, chaotic, unpredictable swaying of the ocean, combined with the dynamic whipping generated by the waves in full motion, the massive metal shackles securing the buoyancy balloons to the historic steel began sliding laterally along the rust. The colossal weight of the massive starboard wall was no longer distributed symmetrically and safely across the support points. One end of the great piece tilted brutally downward into the dark, frozen deep, transferring nearly all of the anchor load onto a single remaining suspension cable. The buoyancy mathematics, until then perfectly balanced and harmonious, disintegrated in an instant. The synthetic equipment that was designed to bear only a modest fraction of the total drag was now single-handedly holding a weight equivalent to multiple full-grown elephants, and doing so under the relentless, unceasing fury of violent jolts generated by the surface storm. The heavy main mooring cables began emitting a sharp, hollow, and sinisterly metallic groan. It was an agonizing sound of material suffering, a mechanical cry that could be physically felt vibrating directly through the steel floor of the control room, sending chills down the spine of everyone present. The structural stress monitors stopped flashing cautionary yellow and locked into a fixed, blazing red alert, announcing imminent disaster. The safety margins stipulated in million-dollar contracts by the world's greatest specialists had not merely been exceeded by the forces of nature, it had been brutally and literally shattered into 1,000 invisible pieces. And it was at that exact crucial second, as the colossal, heavy bow of the salvage ship plunged deep and violently into the dark trough of a giant wave, that the dreaded, definitive point of failure was finally reached. The blast that followed was indescribably overwhelming. A sound so dry and deafening that it instantly stopped the heart and breath of every engineer, sailor, and sonar operator aboard the vessel. This was not a simple, modest snapping of conventional nautical rope. It was the sonic detonation of millions of synthetic fibers bursting simultaneously under the repulsive, crushing, absolutely invincible force of the storming ocean. The physical shock felt through the upper deck structure was immense. The enormous lethal kinetic energy accumulated across hours of unrelenting extreme tension in that cable was suddenly released in a single, fatal crack, so furious that it whipped the dense, cutting night air with destructive violence, striking the dark, churning water surface like the merciless blow of an invisible giant sword. The entire vessel, even protected by its thousands of tons of stabilizing ballast, suffered a dangerous and sudden lurch skyward. At the exact millisecond, the heavy reverse traction pulling it downward vanished into the abyssal deep. The weight relief was so aggressive and devastating that the wide deck tilted dramatically to one side, moments before the powerful engines could fight through the water to recover the ship's trim and correct its course. Inside the immersive control room, the sharp, constant, lifeless beep of the alarm, indicating total loss of tension and load, filled the space with a funereal tone. No one dared whisper a single word of disbelief or shock. The chief engineer simply stared, glassy-eyed and dumbfounded, at the large digital monitor, which now displayed, relentlessly and coldly, the terrible number 0, the fragile material connection between mankind's ambition and the guarded shadows of the most famous shipwreck in all of human history had been severed. And the frozen abyss was reclaiming, once again, its non-negotiable toll. The chain reaction following the deafening blast on the ship's bow was instant and absolutely irreversible. With the lethal snapping of the main synthetic cable, the delicate mechanical harmony keeping the enormous structure floating dangerously near the surface disintegrated in a mere fraction of a second. Without the massive central traction balancing the drag against the furious ocean swell, the monumental weight of the great starboard piece was transferred, all at once, with unparalleled brutality, onto the few secondary supports still intact. The advanced materials and forged steel hooks had not the slightest chance of resisting such kinetic impact. One by one, in an interval of just a few anguished breaths, the metal shackles and thick moorings gave way under the excruciating strain, snapping and whipping the churning water around the salvage ship's hull. Before the wide, helpless, now tear-filled eyes of the experienced film crew, the brilliant engineers and the oceanographers gathered on the storm-swept deck, the disaster consummated itself swiftly and cruelly. The dark giant, which mere moments earlier had been the great cause of a euphoric celebration and proud smiles, tore through the foamy water surface for the last time. The enormous lift bags, now ripped or detached by the uncontrollable fury of the collapse, lost all function entirely. eliminating the last gasp of buoyancy that had been vainly trying to hold that enormous fragment of history. The sepulchral silence that immediately took hold inside the lit command bridge was disturbed only by the merciless sound of giant waves crashing against the thick glass. They had lost the battle, and nature offered no room for argument. Freed completely from earthly moorings and meticulous human planning, the heavy 15 tons of historic steel began an agonizing and solitary free-fall through the frozen abyss of the North Atlantic. The colossal piece of the once majestic passenger liner tore through absolute darkness, plummeting vertiginously through an incredible 12,500 feet of water columns separating our fragile world above the surface from the untouched, shadowy ocean floor. Unlike the cautious, hopeful, and carefully controlled ascent that had lasted endless hours earlier that same night, the descent was a pure, clean, and terrifying demonstration of the relentless law of gravity, acting unchecked in its most inhospitable and punishing environment. The monitor of one of the deep-water remotely operated vehicles could only capture a silent, ghostly shape, sinking like an anchor back into the black veil of the deep sea. It took just over 2 hours by the clock for the immense hull block to cross back through the entire frozen vastness and reach its final destination. And when it did, the impact was cataclysmic and painfully invisible to those enduring the storm above. The solid steel collided with indescribable structural violence against the ocean floor, driving itself deep and definitively into the cold mud and pale sand, falling almost exactly back onto the same desolate plain from which it had been arduously torn just hours before. The thunderous blow raised a colossal cloud of sediment and long undisturbed debris from the seafloor, an underwater storm of suffocating dust that enveloped the piece like a thick and somber funeral shroud. Up on the surface, lashed by the relentless winds of the hurricane, the largest, most ambitious, and most expensive deep-water maritime salvage operation in all of modern history ended in a $1 million failure and an absolutely silent grief. The high-precision sonar on the onboard computers now showed only a desolate void on its darkened screens, scientifically confirming that the sea had not only defended itself mercilessly, but had swallowed its precious trophy back into absolute darkness. What was supposed to be the definitive rescue of a golden age lost beneath the waves had transformed itself, in tragically poetic fashion, into the helpless eyewitness of a devastating second sinking. The bitterly failed salvage of that cold August night in 1996 proved, in an almost poetic and undeniable way, that this immense and tragic ship was never, and perhaps never will be, fully conquered by the intellect and machines of man. The coveted great starboard piece would finally be raised from the ocean floor and brought to daylight 2 years later, in 1998. But that subsequent success was only achieved under absolutely perfect weather conditions and with a doubled engineering support system, proving just how close to the impossible that first attempt truly was. But for the exhausted and frustrated technical crew standing on that deck, swaying under the fury of that first storm, the memory etched into their souls was not of the future victory. What they witnessed through the cold sonar screens was the terrible privilege of watching a painful and melancholic second funeral. That dark night left a frozen and permanent reminder that no matter how advanced our technology or how deep our earthly ambition, the ocean always has the final word. It sets the rules, and it keeps its ghosts exactly as it sees fit. And now, after diving into this profound story and witnessing the relentless fury of the waters, I leave you with a sincere and respectful question. Do you believe modern explorers should continue investing resources to bring pieces up from the ocean floor? Or should this steel giant be left in absolute peace, forever respected as the great graveyard that it is? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I truly value your perspective on this. And thank you so much for joining me all the way to the end.